Hey guys, you probably might be wondering, why am I making a layout in a suitcase? It is a good question. Suitcase layout is a newish idea where you can build a model train layout to fit inside of a suitcase. I never knew much about it beforehand or even if it could be done, but ever since I've noticed others building them, as of the likes of Suitcase Trains on Instagram and That Model Railway Guy's video series, seeing these kinds of layouts have greatly interested me. Not to mention, putting it inside of a suitcase makes it great for portability for model train shows or moving houses, so for me it was a no-brainer. So not long after, I bought myself a very old English travelling suitcase, built beautifully with wooden wraparounds, rivets and leather handles. A suitcase that's come a long way and stood the test of time for over 100 years. Lots of old railway stickers showing its history too, which is wonderful. One important thing I will have to say, if you want to get into making a suitcase layout, being aware of the baseboard size to fit inside of the suitcase, making sure it is big enough to have a good curving radius that trains can handle. Functionality for its suitcase layout would be most important, having enough clearance on the sides to be able to slot the layout up and down into the suitcase with handles that can be easy to grab around. And probably the trickiest thing to consider is keeping the layout secure inside the suitcase when you're carrying it around. You would not want anything to be rattling or breaking inside, so make sure you have some sort of system you can secure the layout in place. Ooh, another thing to consider is making everything as light as possible. With that out of the way, here's my plans for the layout. The measurements of the baseboard: 86 centimeters length by 46 centimeters width and 20 millimeters height. The underframe stretches fully out to the sides, while the front and back frames are further put towards the middle as the suitcase curves inward at the bottom. My plans for the layout is to build the area of the Skarloey Rheneas on the Skarloey Railway in the 1910s and 20s, matching the time period the suitcase was first built. Starting at the front curve before the station is a hill on the corner. At the top is a garden with the house out of shot, inspired by the building just after an overhead bridge at Rheneas on the Tallyclyn Railway. Speaking of the bridge, there has been a bit of some confusion, but not as to any delay thankfully. Annoyingly, I only found out through halfway of the bridge's build that Audrey's Railway Series lore does not have an overhead bridge. And to that, I say, it's my layout so I can put what I want on it. You see, I absolutely love the slate bridge at Rheneas, and it feels like a crime to just not add it in, since I was already building it, so I just ran with it as my own AU as a hybrid of everything. The station is based on Rheneas Station with some slight differences. Additionally, it has an old goods siding that isn't used anymore, and the platform now extends over it to fit more coaches. Behind the station, there will be shrubbery and a line of trees, and further behind that is the beginnings of the village, the blacksmith's forge and the horseman's cottage. Skarloey Rheneas has a history of horses, so there will be a few horse and carts. At the level crossing, there's slight showings of old rails, remnants of the horse-drawn railroad split off from here. Just past it is the curved road and rail, falling between the cliffside and the Ben Glass stream. This is to somewhat resemble the road and rail location where Sir Handel and George had their steamroller shenanigans.
I'm better.
After that, there's an original landscape area that curves over a sheep creep, or a sheep underpass. Moving on to the back will be filled with trees and plant life, disguising the layout almost to give an illusion that hides it from being a loop track. The forest is just a pass-by with a functional siding. There's another dirt road crossing here, and for the road I'll likely hide its connection to the front with an illusion with a hill cutting and a painted middle scene, and finally curving around to the front is a clearing of the forest and the sheep farmer's crossing. It'll have a gate with the farmer and dog, replicating this illustration from Home at Last. Now for the layout build. Preparing the track for the layout, I started masking the rails with Tamiya 3mm masking tape. Starting with a coat of dark brown acrylic, I brushed this on by sweeping the brush up and down the sleepers so I could have the wood grains. Next, I dry brushed a lighter coat of brown to accent the wood grains. Lastly, the sleepers were brushed on lightly with a mid-grey, moving the brush this time in a left to right sweeping motion, making most of the grey show in the centre of the sleepers. This is to portray the fallen ash from the engines. Once everything is dry, you can pull off the masking tape and use a very thin paintbrush to use the lighter brown as earlier to paint the sides of the rails for rust. And boom! Pretty simple really. Going the extra mile to paint up the track can be time consuming, but in my opinion, adding some extra colours is definitely worth it for extra realism. Building up the hills, I drew rough shapes on 20mm polystyrene and cut it to shape with a hot wire cutter. Mine is just a cheap battery powered one. I cut the pieces into varying layers to foam the hills and glued the layers with PVA or UHU polystyrene glue. Once stuck together, I used the hot wire cutter to shape the hills for a more smoother gradient and sanded it down with a bit of coarse sandpaper. I also cut some strips of plasticard to go along the sides of the raised ground for a nice clean edge. They were stuck on with the help of some Sculptimold mix, which is made of 2 parts of 1 part water. Another of the same Sculptimold mixture is applied over top of the hills. It'll take a couple days to at least make sure it sets rock hard and feel dry to the touch. Once so, it can be sanded smooth. I constructed the base for the station bridge with 2mm plasticard. The bridge is built on an angle from the baseboard edge, so it had to be made in mind to make it built flush to the edge. The road floor of the bridge is curved up over the line. For scratch building, I like to use a lot of Wills kits, and for this I use their slate walling. Don't forget when cutting to also cut off the corners in a 45-degree angle for flush corner pieces. Another thing I do is I use a craft knife to carefully score indents to show gaps between the stones. When making things like stone walling and rock details, I go out and collect real ones. I used a line of skinny stones to glue along the tops of the bridge with Woodland Scenics Flexi paste. Once you've glued them on, any gaps you can use Tamiya grey pavement texture paint, as it is a thicker paint that gives off a nice rough and sandstone texture. The build is over and now it's time to paint. Starting off, I use an airbrush and lightly paint for slight weathering. Next, I individually painted the slates with acrylic paint, light and dark grey and a custom light blue-grey mix. After that, I dry brushed white on the slates, sweeping through the brush on downstrokes for highlights. And finally, a black wash was applied. The sheep underpass was built with 3 pieces of plasticard. When using some bigger stones, I glued them around for the opening and glued them onto the layout. I will come back to finish the sheep pass at a later stage. And by this time, I had my first 009 Loco arrive in the mail, none other than the Bachmann Skarloey that I bought from Tuttley Thomas. It is so small seeing it in person, especially to what I've been used to seeing. Seeing others make amazing customs with it, it's inspiring for me that I will want to do the same. Look at the little midget.
What did you do?
To prepare things, I place down the track and pin it temporarily with T-pins, making sure I'm happy with the placement. Once ready, I unpin and add some PVA glue underneath. Cut them to length with a Dremel, which I should say to be careful when using. Wear protective gear. or ask someone experienced for help. As I go around applying the glue, I slot track pieces together with Pico 009 track joiners. With gluing points, make sure you don't apply any glue underneath the moving parts of the switch. After it's stuck down, I solder the rails together. Soldering helps greatly with much stronger electrical connections. Straight after, you can use a file to smooth out the soldering. And finally, the wiring. For such a small layout like this, I'm only making it analog controlled. Here this only needs black and red wires for one side of the layout. 2 holes are drilled beside the outside rails with a red and black wire are poked through each, being soldered to the rails. Now the fun part. With all this hooked up to power, you can now test run your trains. If everything runs smoothly, you can clean the track with IPA and a cloth. Do not use those crappy track rubbers. The only thing they'll do is scratch up the rail tops and affect the performance of your engines. You may as well use coarse sandpaper.
No.
Keep it staying clean for long periods. I highly recommend using No Ox ID. It's an electrical protection grease that you can apply a thin layer with a cloth, and it protects the rails from corrosion. It'll keep the train's wheels protected when they run over it too. For a small tub, it lasts a lifetime. I will put a link in the description because I really do think it's essential for any railway modeler. And with everything said, it's time for a running session. Hey guys, with part 1 came the basics of building the baseboard up to the first running session. Most of the construction building is out of the way, meaning the process of scenics can be added, but in small steps mind you. Since the last video, plans for the layout's design has changed slightly, the biggest difference being that I've taken out the horseman's cottage, the reason being the limited space that makes it look quite cramped in the scene. With small layouts like this, you should be careful to not clutter too many details together, or else it can look forced in. No more cottage on this layout unfortunately. It's half built, and I'll still keep it in storage for a future layout or diorama in the future. Starting off, I completed the layout's main centre of attention, the station building. Originally, I was going to buy a 3D printed model of the Rheneas station by MS Models. Although it is a stunningly detailed building, it is far too expensive with all the added shipping costs to get it to the other side of the globe. So the next thing was to build it from scratch like my overhead bridge. I decided to build the station to more resemble its design in the Railway Series illustrations. The most noticeable difference between it and its real-life basis is the exclusion of the side room that the Rheneas station has. The building process was pretty much the same, apart from that I wanted to add a window opening on the back wall. That I just marked the lines and cut into it from the back side, pressing down cuts until I could pry it off. The front support beams and batten were cut from square balsa wood stick and thin balsa wood sheet. The 2 beams were glued behind the batten. I make some metal bars for the window from flexible wire, wedged inside the window frame and superglued. The interior seating was made from off-cut balsa wood sheet and plasticard. The roof was cut from Wilskit slates. The eaves were cut from balsa wood sheet on an angle. And the ridge was cut from a random piece of thin cardboard packaging, scoring cuts and bent to shape to cover the rooftop. The front gutter and downpipe was sourced from Ratio's building accessories kit, cut to length with an extra piece of moulding support, cut off to extend the gutter slightly. To prepare for painting, I mask off areas to paint the coloured accents. Choosing the main colour for buildings on the Skarloey Railway, I thought red would help make it stand out. Turned on the airbrush and used Valgero's Model Air red paint. Once dry, you can peel off the masking tape. You can dry brush the red parts with grey and brown acrylics for metal or wood chips, and for the gutters case, dark green acrylic for messy gunk. After that, I thought I'd mask and paint up the station interior with a Valero off-white airbrush paint. Painting the rest of the building is pretty much the same process as the slate bridge. Tamiya grey texture paint, airbrush brown weathering, paint individual slates with the free grey acrylics, dark, lighter grey and a blue-grey mix, dry brush white highlights and add a black wash. And finally, I cut a piece of clear plastic for the window glass and stuck it on the inside. The station is all done. Definitely give scratch building a go. Making buildings and infrastructure is a great way to start, and oftentimes it can be a cheap alternative. You can create your own modifications with your build that becomes uniquely yours. Coming back to the sheep underpass, I stuck on small stones stacking onto each other and filling any gaps with smaller pebbles. I applied a black wash to tone down and blend everything together. With the layout design, I planned for the station siding to be covered over by the extended platform, but before that, I wanted to add some rough wooden planks over the old rails. For the planks, I just used some Wills Kit's Wanny edge boarding, priming them, then airbrushing with the Valgero IDF Sinai Grey. After that, I dry brushed green and white acrylics, applied a black wash, then stuck them in position. Now for the raised platform ground, this was made with 2 layers of 3mm foam board glued together with Yoo-hoo polystyrene glue. Don't use the regular stuff like I did. I was rushing and didn't pay attention to the type of glue I was using. The regular glue melted into the foam, and when it dried it had lots of dip. I was able to smooth it out again, but still, save yourself the hassle and just use wood glue. Can't go wrong with that. I was able to add the finishing terrains with one last batch of sculptor mold to join around the slate bridge. By this time, I had painted light and dark brown acrylics of the base dirt undercoat. It's not the final look, so we're not going to comment on what it looks like. We're not going to comment that it looks like chocolate cake or dog poo. Moving back to the platform, I cut down individual pieces of Wills Kit's Yorkshire stone pavements into slate slabs for the platform edging. Offcuts of the slate walling were cut to fit along the side of the platform before priming and painting. Then all the pieces were stuck down and pinned. I thought I would experiment with raising the platform ground cover slightly with a custom paste mix. The paste mix consists of Woodland Scenics Flexi Paste, Tamiya Grey texture paint, and real sand. I spread out the paste mix with craft trowels to the height of the platform slabs. The mix should take a day or 2 to dry, which did turn out with slight cracks, but I've personally left them in as they leave a nice detail. Regardless, you can paint over the cracks with the grey texture paint as a filler if you would prefer. The rock faces were made from a method that was used on my first layout. I folded and scrunched up tinfoil and folded the sides upwards as a moulding tray. Using tinfoil is a cheap and great method since it can be reused and make very unique rock patterns each time. You can't do the same with those overrated rubber rock castings that just make the same molds over and over again. You can scrunch up the tinfoil as little or as much as you like for harsher or smoother rock patterns. Now you can mix up some plaster and spread a thin layer onto your tinfoil molds. The thinner the plaster layer, the lighter your molds will be. Once hardened, you can pull off the tinfoil to see your perfect rock molds. Except they're not perfect just yet. I'll usually break them up into smaller pieces. You can just flip your molds face down and use a hammer to just tap at them. That'll be enough to break them apart and they'll make good, natural looking rock pieces. Next you can place them together onto your layout, picking and choosing pieces that can fit together like a puzzle. Then you can glue them into place. I'd recommend using some sort of fast drying glue to stick them on quickly so they don't fall off a cliff face. If not, you can just use PVA or Yoo-hoo glue for any non-vertical surfaces. When it's rock hard, you can fill in the gaps with any sort of wall filler. After the wall filler is hardened, you can put on a PVA and black paint mix. Just a coat is needed to fill the gaps and rock crevices, as well as to strengthen the plaster from chipping. Now the rock painting. It was a rough start painting many coats of grey to try and get the beige look, and that turned out to be an absolute waste of time.
Thomas felt terrible. 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 Terrible.
Stop it. Get some help.
And some help I did get from my mummy. So I mixed up these colours, using the more saturated beige first, then the more brighter beige with less coverage, and then a black wash to tone it all together. Putting on some sand on my chocolate cake, I apply some Mod Podge onto all the off-road dirt and sprinkle a good covering of sand, and the dirt road I sieve a layer of a homemade dirt and grout powder mix. For ground covers underneath the trees, I wanted to make the dirt darker for forest shading. I just sprinkled some homemade dark brown dirt powder and Woodland Scenics brown medium ballast. Sprinkled it in some other areas where trees would later be planted. Oh, what's this? Looks like some track work is being repaired. You see, there was slight problems with this bit of track. It wasn't soldered very well and had bumps on them which affected Skarloey's running capabilities. Plus, it looks unprofessional seeing him bump around like a bucking bronco. I didn't remember to record this part purely because I didn't want to make a fool of myself on camera. Basically, I got the rotary tool to cut away the rough section of track, and thankfully I had a spare piece of track all painted up and I just cut it to size. With cutting to length, you do want to be careful not to cut your track piece too short, as you'll want to avoid having any empty gaps between the rails. It's better to cut slightly longer and just shave off bits until it can slot in snugly. And then you can clip, pin, glue and solder it on. Another unexpected problem arose as I gave Skarloey a test run. For some reason, the siding had lost power whenever I would try to get Skarloey past the track point. The only logical solution I could think of was to add a pair of wires for the siding, drilling some holes and soldering a black and red wire onto the rails. The other ends were just poked and screwed into the wire block to connect the power again. And to my delight, it worked.
Oh, yes! Yes, it works! Oh, I'm so happy.
Back to the dirt, I use my airbrush to change the colour, starting off with the Valero IDF Cyanide Grey for darker areas of the dirt roads, and then Valero Burnt Umber for off-road. I protected any off-spray from going onto the track with off-cut paper, and give it a test run. All the electricals are running well, and now I can put the ballast over the track. I was a little nervous about ballasting the points, so I left them for last, spreading out the ballast with the help of a paintbrush, sweeping any ballast off the sleepers. Also, tapping the rails with the handle end of the paintbrush helps with the vibrations moving the ballast off the sleepers. After that, I used my pointy tool thing to pick off ballast that snuck inside the inner parts of the rails. This is because of the no oxide electrical grease. I like to keep my rails protected 24/7, but if you haven't applied no oxide onto the rails, then this shouldn't be a problem. With crossings, make sure you have any sort of rolling stock with wheel flanges that can clear space on the inner parts of the rails before glue application. For gluing most of the track, I first spray on some IPA or isopropyl alcohol in a small spray bottle. IPA helps break the tension for then the glue to soak in. The glue is a 50-50 mix of PVA wood glue and water that is put into a droplet bottle. If the glue isn't soaking into the ballast well enough, Spraying over more of the IPA helps wet the ballast enough for the glue to settle in. I wanted to be a bit more careful with applying the ballast to the points, so I spread out some normal PVA between the sleepers, then sprinkled the ballast over the top, spreading it off the sleepers with the paintbrush. Finishing off the dirt, I sieved some more of the dirt grout mixture over top of the crossings. Just a thin layer to cover the ballast will do. Making sure to wipe off the tops of the rails with a cotton bud to keep the track clean before gluing. Gluing is the same method as the ballast. A few weeks ago, I ordered a 3D printed batch of brown Marshall Teleclin 1-3 coaches from Tyneside Models on Miniature Modelers Hub. The prints look stunning with all the detail on them. These are my first customs I've made for 009, and I knew I wanted to do a good job on them. Painting them up is a very simple process. Blue is the Army Painter's Crystal Blue, and the off-white is Skeleton Bone. These were a great starting point for me to dabble into custom model making. At the making of this video, I've ordered some number and lettering decals from Railway Mania Shop and Enden Valley Custom Decals for the coaches and future engines I want to make. Time to finish off the track work with weathering. For in areas where engines stop, say at the station or the siding, there'll be a whole collection of soot or other gunk from underneath the engines. To give a base texture, I just painted some Tamiya pavement texture paint between the rails. Next I added a black wash over all the ballast, and then I painted over the texture paint in black acrylic to a suitable colour. After that, I mixed up a dark grey-brown acrylic and began dabbing the brush lightly over the ballast in areas to darken where under trees. I also added it on the surrounding dirt that'll be under the trees. I was considering getting rust and soot powders, but then I remembered about another cheap alternative. Pastels. Chalk pastels to be exact. I mixed up my own consistencies for rust, ash and dust powders by chucking a pastel or two into a Ziploc bag and crushing it up until it becomes a fine powder. Then it can just be stored into little screw-on tubs. The rust powder was brushed along the sides of the rails and sleepers. You can apply it as heavy or as light as you want to. Here's the comparison showing how well it works for giving your track an aged look. I also used the dust and ash powders. The dust powders were applied to the thin sheep tracks and the ash for over the dark soot patches. Finishing off the back scene, I built a quick little coal bunker, painted and weathered it up, and glued it with a small pile of coal and stacked up spare sleepers to the side. And there you go, all the basic groundwork is done, and it's really starting to look good now. It just needs some plants. Soon it will be time to eat your green, Suitcase Layout. Time to run trains. Well, a train. I only have one at the moment. Hi guys, it's been a while since I last shared content about my layout progress, but now the final part that you've all been waiting for is here. A lot of time has gone into the layout, and this video will have a lot to cover, so let's get into it, shall we? Starting off with the groundwork in the forest, I scatter some woodland scenics, burnt grass, fine turf thinly over the areas. It's supposed to look like moss or short patches of grass. Once dry, I then lightly airbrush over it in Valgero brown to tone it down a bit for a better contrast with the dirt. With the static grass and water resin, they were something that I hadn't had much experience with, so I knew I wanted to start making tests into the layout lab. The resin I got was a 2-part mix. Make sure you're wearing gloves and you can mix equal parts into an old plastic cup, and you can also add a few droplets of Woodland Scenics water tints for colour, stirring it all in with a lolly stick. For me, I have a little 00 gauge diorama for me to try it out on, but I'd recommend testing it in a discardable container or tray. Just testing a thin layer should be enough. If you're going to put resin up along the edges of the layout, make sure to cover up the sides with a clear plastic or anything solid. Fill in the gaps, and I add some extra glue and masking tape along the sides and the bottom, just to make sure that there's not going to be any leakages. For drying, it'll take a couple days. I'd play it safe and at least give it 3 days until you can take the side panels off. You need to make sure that it is rock solid. If it isn't, it'll be more of a jelly-like consistency, and it won't come off very well at all. Be patient with the resin. You can only do it once. At least for static grass, it's more forgiving. But I still wanted to experiment with different colours and layering. I started testing with balsa wood squares, painting them brown and gluing sand over, and then airbrushing for the dirt base. Brush on a bit of glue and add some static grass with your applicator. Have a think about where you want your grass to go, or how you want your grass to look like. What season are you wanting to model? For a hot summer grass might be a mixture of yellow and green, and it might be a bit shorter too. Or spring and autumn, if there's more rain, the grass would be greener, wouldn't it? My grass is certainly green and in various lengths. I use many lengths from 2.5 to 7mm. Anything longer, I might make into reeds or tall flowers. It might be worth adding a bit of darker colours of grass for in shaded areas. Definitely experiment with different colours and lengths. I know with things like static grass, it's not the cheapest to source from, but they do last you a while, especially if you're able to mix them up. Now I can apply the static grass on, working in sections at a time, brushing on PVA glue first, then putting my first layer of static grass on. With layering, I'd recommend going from short to long lengths. You should be able to carry on with the static grass while it's drying. The static grass applicator is good for applying in bulk areas, but it's a bit harder for it to reach in the smaller crevices. I find using the good old Hornby Scale Scenics puffer bottle good for blowing in those hard to reach places. Any loose static grass can be sucked into a thin stocking that's wrapped over a small portable vacuum cleaner. That way your static grass can be reused without any wastage. And now you can touch your grass. Go on, touch it, and go tell the haters that you've gone and touched grass. You should be pleased. With the resin, I mixed the resin up and added a couple of drops of blue water tint and hoped for success as I poured it in. I covered it over with a paper towel to protect from dust and tapered down the sides. I had a bit more of spare resin, so I used it on the dirt roads as puddles after a bit of autumn rain, applying lightly in dipped road areas. Again, give the resin at least 3 days to dry before adding anything else onto the layout. While letting the resin on the layout to dry, I thought I'd start by making the trees. Some of my first ones here are made from twisted florist wire. Varying number of wires being twisted together can make different sizes and thicknesses. I'd recommend making about 4 to 12 groups of wires per each tree. Varying tree sizes can be roughly 8 trees per packet, so you might need to get more if this is your preferred method for making trees. With this layout, I wanted to experiment with different ways of making trees that I enjoyed most with a good outcome. I'll get onto my other tree making methods later. 3 days later, I could turn my attention back to the layout. Taking another inspection of the hill behind the bridge, something about it looked off to me. Checking the cottage pictures from the real life inspiration, I noticed that the hill was a lot shorter and a much smoother gradient than I had designed it. So I had to gouge into the hill with a chisel to shorten over half of its original height and reapply the dirt cover and grass again. It was definitely a change worth doing in the long run. I wouldn't have been able to fit the cottage inside of the suitcase if I hadn't. I switched my attention to building the cottage. Basic construction is the same process as the overhead bridge with plasticard, leaving the front and backs open for the Wills kit's lime wash stone and random stone sheets. Cutting balsa wood strips for around the windowsills, then glued Wills kit's window frames behind the plastic sheets. Then, using ratio gutters and downpipes, and the Wills kit slate sheets added to the roof. I made the top chimney pipe with a empty wire tube and wrapped it around a piece of milliput. Also using the milliput for around the base of the chimney, I mostly painted everything by hand, leaving the limestone walls in its original white plastic, but I gave it a watered down brown and dark green washes. And for the roof, I picked out the different slate tiles in a lighter grey and used the same paint on the top of the chimney stack. Then I lightly weathered the roof in Valgero brown through the airbrush. Carrying on around the cottage, I cut up a couple off-cut pieces with Wills kit's cobblestones, picked out slabs in different greys, a black wash, and using some of my own brown dust pastel powder that settled in over the joins before gluing them around the cottage. I made the walling around the cobbles with the usual Wills kit slate walling, painted them up and bending them by hand to curve around the cobble flooring. I then glued a thin strip of plasticard on top of the wall for some jumbled slates cut from a clear plastic sheet. Balsa wood was also cut into strips of battens and posts. The top half has a shrubbery going along the top wood walling, but I'll come back to that in the next section. For now, I wanted to create all of the wooden fencing around the layout. Making them from scratch is quite simple. Superglue helps with gluing posts and fencing rails together. I don't glue all of it together yet, as it'll be easier to fit them into the needed areas. Gave them a brown and green wash, having it soak really nicely into the wood and scattering some fake moss over the fencing. The gates are a bit different, being mostly made from clear plastic sheeting. I ended up making 2 gates, using boltwood for the sides and gluing horizontal rails to replicate a good gate from this illustration. At one of the past exhibitions I went to, I found an old Langley Models white metal market scene kit, and I thought it would do the job for filling up the empty space beside the village forge. I was able to follow the instructions and superglue everything together, and then painted them all up. For making shrubbery, I experimented with a few different methods. For the hedge over by the cottage, I used some coconut fibre at first. It's not the best thing to use for a tidy hedge, to be frank. It falls apart and separates easily. So instead, I used some natural lichen, gluing the pieces over around the top of the walling, which was much easier. Finally, putting some moss and leaf scatter with a light airbrush weathering. Some of the moss and leaf scatter ended up across the grass in front of the walling, which I liked the look of, so I sealed them in with spray glue. I did end up using some coconut fibre in the end. Most of them were made from my first layout. Gluing scatters and shrubbery is universally the same premise, using glue spray. One thing using glue sprays, though, is ideally, it's always good to clean out the spray nozzle with some warm soapy water. Spraying it out from the inside helps clear out all of the system. Leaving the glue inside, I find, can block the nozzle inside and makes it relatively useless. So instead, I switched to using some cheap hairspray, and surprisingly, it works really well as a scatter adhesive. Plus, it smells really nice. No more of glue and chemicals. You didn't hear that last part. I just might use a little bit on my hair as well. All scatters can be glued the same way for any type of shrubbery. The kind of shrubbery methods I used was coconut fibre, Woodland Scenics polyfibre, some twine, and lichen. Heaps of variations. Preparing for the scatters, I glued down along some parchment paper with wood glue. Gluing it on parchment paper makes them easy to pull off the paper again. All scatters are applied in layers. Using the hairspray makes each layer dry really quickly, being another plus. For scatters, I always start with dark going on to light on the tops for highlights. Finally, I can easily peel them off of the parchment paper and stick them onto the layout. Another kind of shrubbery I made was prickle bushes or mountain ash. Mountain ash is a kind of shrub that you'd find at Krasny and I made them out of twine. First, I pinch one side and twist the twine out at the other end and raffle it out. Then below, I cut it, and then I put a dollop of wood glue on some parchment paper and stick the twisted out twine onto it to leave it to dry. For the meantime, you can keep making as many as you'd like. Once all dry, I give them a hairspray and sprinkle some static grass to look like more branches. Then I gave them a hairbrush Then I gave them an airbrush in Valgero Brown. Next I gave them another hairspray, adding some leaf scatters and a light sprinkle of red flowers for tiny red berries. Now they're all done, and I can remove them off the parchment paper and glue them onto the layout. I mainly put them behind the rock face on the steep hill to make it look a bit more natural. As you've seen, from making shrubbery and scenics in general, I've used quite a bit of natural products for it. It's a really good option grabbing something like lichen or branches from the backyard, or in my case, from a farm. They're usually for free most of the time, so get outside and see what you can find. It helps being out in nature that you can visualize how trees and plant life grow, and you never know what you might find that you could use for on your own layout. Just remember with some things that there might be bugs inside of them, which soaking anything into a tub of isopropyl alcohol for a few minutes and rinse off should help kill any tiny infestations. So, I'm going to share some video vlog clips of the kind of things that I've collected. Shan't be long. Hi guys, I'm going for a bit of a vlog video or whatever. I'm looking for some natural products for my model railway, for the trees in particular. Taking my dog along there too. Hey, come on. Yeah, and I'm trying to find some branches or small trees. I know a lot of modelers use sea moss, and sea moss is good. It looks good for making small trees and extension of branches, but I find that sea moss is very hard to come by in New Zealand. I do have some moss at home, but it is quite hard to, yeah, there's not really much I can do with it. It's not really enough for what I need, so I'm going to be using the sea moss quite sparsely for some of the smaller bushes, so they'll do great for those. But for something to use smaller trees, I've found a different method, and it's this stuff. This stuff is called heather, and it's got some really nice fine branches on it. Show an example of the heather here, how it's quite good for trees. See if I cut this little piece here, that'll make quite a good tree if it's try and make it see like that. If you just see if that's like on the hill or something, that would make a really good small tree. I've also got this stuff I found. I think it is this heather stuff as well, but it's just more fresher stuff, and they will do okay for making pine trees or whatever if I decide to do it. No, more like eight, and chopping them down to size, they will make great little trees. Hey, hello. And yeah, they'll make good stuff, good branches for that. Chop them to size. They're a little bit tougher. Heather is a bit tougher than sea moss too, so it's not as brittle. so it should be good. And I have also found finding sources for ferns is very hard to find too. And I know a 009 modeler uses moss for ferns, and this stuff is a type of moss, and this is probably the closest I can find to making it look like ferns. So that'll be alright for that. You just gotta use what you can find, and sometimes the best materials are stuff you can find out in nature. So very good. And there you have it. Model railways can be an outside hobby too. Duh! Like with the shrubbery, I have a couple different methods with making tree trunks. I wanted to choose one that I've had the most enjoyment making, that wasn't going to be as time consuming, making many trees. And with the layout, it's meant to have a lot of trees on it. Over 30 trees, I counted it all myself. The first method was using florist wire. Doing it this way takes a lot of time and patience, and I don't think it looks as good as the others, so I'm probably not going to be going for this kind of foliage again. Another way which I've seen is the most popular method is using seafoam trees, and I got the autumn version by WW Scenics. Making these kits are pretty simple. Trim off pieces and use some quick drying glue and stick them onto the tree bases, spraying primer, then airbrushing different browns, and finally a hairspray to sprinkle on some foliage on top. I'm pretty happy with this method. It makes really good trees, and it's really that fine detail to the branch tips that really catch your eye. I only made one as I'm trying to use the seafoam sparingly, but definitely my second favourite method. I will quickly note that another method that I've considered is making trees from yarrow, which you should be able to find them easily in grass pastures. I've noticed that most model railroad modelers from New Zealand use it, and I haven't seen it done anywhere else, which I find really interesting. While I haven't made any yarrow trees, I would consider making them in the future. Oh, and one other thing, as I explained in my vlogs, was making tree trunks from heather. This method was way quicker than all the previous ones. It literally only took less than 5 minutes to make them. It makes it my #1 favorite method for making trees. I didn't need any painting. All it had was the polyfiber and foliage on them, and they were all done. They look so realistic, because they technically are. All the rest of the trees I made this way for the rest of the layout. Now I'm aware that not everyone has heather or know much about it. Pretty sure it's not in America, but I'm sure you will be able to find some nice thin twigs where you may have them. Though I will say to try and find something that isn't too brittle. I choose heather since it can bend and won't break easily, even with using the thinnest tips. So with the trees ready, I got a little pin drill and began drilling each individual hole for each tree to be glued. And I found it really satisfying putting on all the lovely red, yellow and orange trees onto the layout. It really gives a nice pop of colour. I've also thought I'd scatter a bit more knock leaves below the trees for the leaves starting to fall. I sealed them in place with a watered down glue. Since designing my own Skarloey Rheneas faces, I've made many more 3D files that have helped me to build my collection of rolling stock and add little extra details to the layout. For rolling stock, I've made a 6-pack of Skarloey Railway Quarryman's coaches, a dandy wagon with horse, and I'm currently still needing to finish my version of the Weed Killer. I also printed out a Festiniog gunpowder wagon, which I found on Thingiverse, painted it up in black and gave it a really nice rust effect by Deluxe Materials. And for the rest of the scenic detailing, I made my own whistle speed signs, painted them up, glued a wire peg underneath and drilled holes for that to be stuck around the layout. There are also some station benches which my mate Chandler gave me his digital file to print out. I also found a 3D file online of a horse and cart that I printed out too. It really adds character to the layout, and it sends home that the layout is set in the 1920s and the previous time periods. The last thing I printed was a pack of crates and suitcases, which, again, I found online. The suitcases caught my eye in particular, as they looked very similar to my own suitcase. Why don't I paint up my own miniature replica? Since deciding the idea of securing the layout inside the suitcase, I had long since ditched it, as I wanted to have the option to take it out, say for wire adjustments or to just play with the layout on another tabletop. I also wanted to fit a storage box or two underneath, which I had to add some peg legs just to heighten it a tad. Next, I gave the whole sides of the baseboard a watered down brown paint to give off a wood stained effect. I finally decided to remove the original fake leather handles and replace them with real leather that I sourced from a broken belt. 3D prints aren't the only way I like to make my rolling stock. I also seem to enjoy making up kits, so I bought a Tally-Klin gunpowder wagon and a 5-pack of Tally-Klin mixed wagons, both from Dundas Models. The kits were quite easy and fun to make up, and they were primed and painted in their respective colours before slotting the wheels in between the axle boxes. And then they can have the usual black wash and weathering powders. You all know the deal.
Baking powder.
Something I wasn't originally planning on adding was lighting to the building. But by this time, I wanted to change that. I went into town and bought an LED light strip and some red and black wires. Other than soldering, that's all you really need. I made sure for the LEDs to try and go for a warmer yellow tone, something that's dimmer the better. You don't need it too bright at all. Now with LED strips, there's lines marked for where you can cut them. I'd measure how long the roof is on the building and cut it so that it can fit inside. Now for the wiring, take whatever buildings you are going to use off the layout, or in my case, because the buildings were already stuck on, I just pried them off the roofs and carefully drilled a hole through the baseboard so that both black and red wires can poke through from underneath. Now get the solder out and solder one wire to those little tabs close to the cut edge. If you are lighting up more than one building, you should either make a wire junction below the baseboard or solder the wires to the other side of the first LED you've connected and string it back below to poke out into another building. The LED strip should have an adhesive back to it, so you should just be able to stick it where it should be hidden from view, under the front side of the roof for example. Before closing the roof, test out the LEDs first, connect them to your controller or to a power source and try turning them on. They should work just like that, but my ones were very bright, so I'd recommend to paint up over the LED lights in a black acrylic, and that will dimmer the brightness the more you add over. Now that's better. With that, everything on the layout is finished. Now the choice of couplings that I've used my stock has changed around quite a bit. I first started off with the regular 009 Bachmann couplers, but I always knew I wanted to switch over to something more automatic. Being able to couple and uncouple automatically sounds really appealing to me. Uncoupling those tiny couplings can be a bit frustrating doing it by hand, and making them automatic seems like a really good idea for when I do want to display them at model railway exhibitions. So the most logical solution was to buy the Greenwich couplings. They are brass kits that, following the instructions and bending them to shape, make good little couplings, and some thin magnetic wire can be winded around the coupler loop piece, which this pairs well with also getting their little magnets that can be glued underneath the track. Getting the finished coupler in close proximity to the ground magnet makes the coupler hook lift up in order for it to couple and uncouple to stock much easier. One issue I have found with the couplers, the instructions can be a bit complicated for beginners, and the plug-in piece is a bit too loose to fit in when plugging into NEM pockets, being thin brass, which They also supply 3D printed coupler hooks that fit into the NEM pockets much better. But I didn't know about them at the time, so I designed my own. I designed them almost exactly the same way as the 3D printed couplings, but I shortened its length a tad. Doing so has helped make the stock look more coupled closer together, making the gap between them look a bit more realistic. With magnets that go under the track, have a think about the areas where you want your trains to uncouple. I have at least 3 magnets around the layout, one beside each end of the station platform and one at the end of the siding. I drilled in a hole carefully with the power drill. I'd also recommend getting Greenwich's coupling height gauge, which that helps measure how deep the magnet is so that it's not too far apart from the couplings to react. Then you can just glue the magnets into each hole and cover each one with some ballast. And I like to leave a couple marking spots so I know where the magnets are. Now the final thing for the couplers is to test them over the magnets. As I said, the coupler loop should lift up when on top of the magnet areas. But if it's not doing that, you might have to make a couple tweaks to the couplers, like using your finger to press the loop up, checking the movement is not stiff. If that's not the case, then I'd recommend replacing the magnet wire for one end of it to poke towards the middle. That will help with the magnet to recognize the coupler better. I made final checkups to make sure everything was performing well before taking the layout to showcase at the model route. Actually, I don't need to say about this. I've had some of you comment asking about how much the suitcase cost to make. Lucky for you, I've been saving all my receipts and price tallies. I'm not good at maths at all. So let's add it all up in my phone calculator. Oh, that many dollars? Now that's certainly not cheap, is it? It is not a cheap hobby. But as long as you buy just the basic at first, and slowly work at what you need, you should be able to make your own. For this video, I'll be sharing with you how I made my custom Skarloey and Rheneas models. Out of the 2 engines, I bought Skarloey as my first 009 model. Rheneas I ended up getting later on because, you know, he's got quite a few inaccuracies. I knew I wanted to get straight into him first. Rheneas was also the easier out of the 2 to customize. You'll find out why later. With making both Skarloey and Rheneas, I wanted to modify them to have more realistic detailing. Most 009 modelers use the 4D's Dolgok and Teleclin conversion kits. Dolgok is a different type of kits based on the different eras, which I ended up choosing era 1. I'm quite impressed with the valued detail on both, especially with the pipe detailing wrapping around the boiler. Be very careful when handling these kits. It's easy to snap off details, even quite by accident. I ended up snapping off this handle part late into the build when trying to remove print supports I had missed. I thought I would start on Rheneas first, moving the original body. Removing the original body and test fitting the new one. I then decided to switch onto Skarloey instead, prying off that big sunny smile and pulling him apart into individual pieces. Why I went onto Skarloey so early, I have no idea. I wouldn't recommend making Skarloey as your first 009 custom. simply because of how much you have to take them apart and the amount of modifications you would have to do to it compared with making Rheneas. Like with Skarloey's footplate piece, for example. I planned on removing the center footplate and wheel splashes as they were absent from his original build. So that means getting out the Dremel and carefully cutting off the footplate up to the sides. Thankfully, it was easy enough to know where to cut up to. There's one of the coal loads that needs removing, and to also remove the fake handrail lumps on the side tank and smoke box. Finally cutting off the pointless piece covering behind the cab windows. A personal preference I decided to do was to cut off one side of the cab panels, just to add a bit of difference to each side. I will say, cutting through die-cast metal with a Dremel, do take your time on it. It'll take a while for it to cut through. Wear eye protection and give the Dremel a break whenever you feel the metal heat up, or else it can turn into ouch! You will also need to use a drill piece to drill holes through those fake handrail lumps. It's easier to know where to drill holes when the original paint is still on. Be careful not to bend the drill bits while going in. After that, I test fitted the handrail knobs, which are the short 4mm handrail knobs by Alan Gibson. Now we can strip the paint. For the die-cast metal, I used indoor paint stripper. All it needs is just a rough paintbrush, applying until the paint softens, which the black paint came off almost instantly, while the red had to have a bit more persuasion. For the rest of the plastic parts, I just put them into a tub of Dettol antiseptic liquid for a couple hours, and then used an old toothbrush to scrub off. The final details like the smokebox front and interior cab detailing can now be glued. I switched my attention back to Rheneas, gluing the top half of the cab and the body onto cotton buds, spraying a couple Valgero primer coats. Doing the same with Skarloey, but also painting the extra footplate that came part of the conversion kit. I thought it would be a good idea to use it as a swap out for the two different footplate designs. It actually came to me a bit bowed in the mail, so I had to heat it up with the hairdryer to gently bend it back to shape. I then painted Rheneas into Army Painter's pure red, thinning down the paint for the airbrush. I then went on to masking, airbrushing and hand painting Rheneas' smokebox and other black parts with Army Painter's black. It was quite difficult to paint the lower part of the boiler, so that required a few touch-ups. In between that, I was also masking off Rheneas' chassis and motor, painting the cylinders in primer and red, then painting the front and back of the cylinders black. And you're probably asking me by now, are you going to be painting the chassis block in matte? Well, I'm sorry, but I am and was too scared to take off the wheels, risking losing pieces or not running the same afterwards, only just to make the chassis block look less shiny. To be honest, I've left it as it is. It really doesn't bother me, the gloss, at all. Next, I painted the cab interior in Army Painter's Arid Earth. This required a few coats. Rheneas had all metal details painted in gold, brass and silver acrylics. He then was given a gloss varnish coat. I applied before adding the decals, as it's a smoother surface to adhere. Give it at least a day to dry. While that was drying, I thought I would make up Skarloey's handrails, threading 0.4mm thin silver wire and then gluing the knobs along the 3 holes on the smokebox. For the saddle tank handrails, I bent 1mm thicker wire into the holes and then glued them from underneath. And then I repeated the same painting process for Skarloey. Why are both engines red? Are you thinking to each other? How are you supposed to tell them from apart? Because it's Railway Series accurate, that's why. Now onto the decals. I got all the blue lining from Fox Transfers, and the names I got from Railway Mania shop. Decals are pretty easy to apply once you get into the rhythm. You can cut the lining slightly longer, doesn't matter about perfect measurements. Soak them in for about half a minute, apply some micro set to the area on the model, grab the decal out of the water with fin tip tweezers, slide the decal off from the paper onto the model, and roll the tip of a cotton bud over the decal to press out any liquid that might be under the decal. Once it's dry, you can touch up the corners of the decals with red again. The blue lining applied on really well. The yellow name decals didn't so much. I'm not sure what I could have done wrong with this. You can see where the edging of the decal is slightly peeling off. Not really what I was wanting. Oh well, I should be able to fix it by stripping the decal and adding some fox yellow lettering for next time. I sealed the decals in place with Valgero matte varnish in 2 coats to make sure they were fully dried and sealed. Wait for at least 24 hours. Now for some people, they would just be happy with calling the models finished. I'm not. I'm a withering daredevil. I've weathered all of my other rolling stock anyways, so for these two, it's no different. For both of them, I first gave them a black acrylic wash. I've tried enamel washes before, but I've personally found that they don't give me enough drying time to help spread and thin the wash out. With washed down acrylics, it gives me a lot more time to add more in areas or absorb some away with a paintbrush. I'd recommend practicing on something else first to get a good understanding of where you want the weathering to go. There's no art to weathering. You'll know just where to put it, and it won't matter how it turns out, because really, that's the only point of doing it, is to make it
dirty.
Something else I like to do when the wash is almost dry on the model is to lightly rub a wet cotton bud towards the center areas like the bunker, cab and saddle tank sides to give off a look of a quick clean before starting another run. I absolutely love the effect that it has. The final part of weathering is to add powders. Dust or ash powders can easily be made with cheap pastels that you might have around your home. Just smash up a colour or two into a Ziploc bag and there's your homemade weathering powders. You really don't have to buy expensive weathering powders, especially if you're starting out. You can always upgrade to them in the future. With pastel powders, they're pretty easy to apply with a small paintbrush. With weathering powders, I'm not using it as heavily as I would with the black wash. Try and find areas where dust and soot may gather. For starting out, finding references might help give you a better understanding of where to apply it. To seal the To seal the powders in place, I applied another clear varnish coat. The clear printed window specs can be glued for Rheneas' cab, and for Skarloey, clear plastic squares are cut and glued inside the cab. Well, here are Skarloey and Rheneas themselves finished, but they both need a crew to drive them. Engines can't drive themselves after all, most of the time. I bought my first Model U figures, 2 Teleclin Dolgok crew packs. They were primed then painted with Citadel Kislev flesh for the skin tones and Reekland flesh shade. Painted the clothing acrylics and added a black wash. They were glued into the engine's cabs with little adjustments. I personally left out gluing Rheneas' top half of his cab so I could have Rheneas in his original cabless design. The two look as realistic as they can be now, but why don't we bring them to life? Botty. Why don't we bring them to life? With faces, like the new revamp. As you can see, I have some new faces for both Skarloey and Rheneas. I have had past experience making 3D models. It's something that I had wanted to do for a long time, to be able to make my own designs and print out for my own usage, or to be able to share them with others. Rather than relying on others to make custom faces, I thought I would make my own. Most people use Blender, but for this I used Nomad Sculpt. I like how much simpler the setup and tools are. That it's an iPad app that I can take anywhere with me. I started drawing concept sketches on Procreate, drawing up to 14 expressions for each, taking inspiration from the Railway series and TV series faces to make my own styled faces. I saved them as a reference photo to sculpt over, starting with basic shapes of cylinders and spheres, adding the shapes, joining and blending them together into each individual expression. I kept in mind that I wanted to have these faces fit over the smokebox details, so behind the face I've cut into them to accommodate the fitting in front. It took a while to make them, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Other people have asked me for copies for their own models, which I've been happy to oblige. Shameless plug here, but if you want any of these 3D files or want to commission me, you can message me on either my Discord, Instagram or Ko-Fi, all at MoreMJ's Trains. And hopefully sometime in the future I will potentially be setting up an Etsy or eBay page to sell my products to you. The next thing is to have them 3D printed. Round about this time, I was highly anticipating a resin 3D printer to arrive in the mail, though that was short-lived as I found it too confusing to set it up all at first. I did eventually get everything set up and tried my first test print. Successful. Now printing the faces. It took a couple tries to get right. A couple of things I should tell you to be aware of is if you are buying a resin 3D printer, make sure you follow all the instructions, use the proper tools for its intended use, and level the base plate properly before printing. It needs to be set to the angle that your printer surface is on. Even if you move it slightly off place afterwards, it will cause another failed print because it is not level and you will have to re-level it again. Choose its final resting spot and make sure it's final. I thought I would bring this to attention because it's really important to be taking good care of your printer, especially with how expensive they can be. But through time and understanding, you will be able to use it safely and successfully. After many trials and learning, I finally had my face designs printed perfectly. This was something I created into reality. And since then, I've almost always been making new things to print out for my layout or any other side projects.
Oh, hello there. I'm Skarloey.
And now on to painting the faces. It was easier to paint the faces while they were still connected to the print supports, spraying primer and then airbrushing white all over. Then I hand painted around the faces with Army Painter's Gargoyle Grey, painting around the white eyes and the smiling teeth. Finally, hand-painted the black pupils, eyelashes and eyebrows with a fine-tip brush. There's nothing wrong with fine detailing goes off the mark. You can always give it a touch-up with the base colour again to sharpen the edges of the eyebrows. And finally hand-brushed gloss varnish over the eyes and teeth for a nice sheen. I haven't gone about weathering the faces yet, but when I do, I'll add a black wash and maybe a little ash pastel powders to the top of the foreheads and noses. But other than that, they are finally finished, apart from the number and builders plates I ordered. If you were wondering why it took me so long to release this video, this is the reason why. Custom brass etch plates from light railway stores. All I can give is a quick summary of what I would do with them. I would paint a quick coat of black over the etch plates, and once dry I would sand over them with the fine grit to retain the lettering details and stick them onto the sides of the bunkers. Now, let's give them a running session.
All right then.
Hey, thanks for listening to over an hour's worth of a guy with a voice as smooth and soothing as an ASMR video for railway modelling. It's been a full year since I began uploading YouTube videos about this suitcase layout. Currently, I've got over 750 subscribers, lots of comments and thousands of views, which I've been pretty happy with, though it's the enjoyment of making what I do that I love the most. But now, for my first full year as a YouTuber, I just want to say thank you for watching my videos, and more will be on the way.